Welcome everyone to the Texas OnCourse monthly webinar series. We are wrapping up the school year. I hope you all successfully wrapped up the school year with your students. I think almost everyone is out of school. This morning, our webinar for June is K through 12 updates from the most recent 87th legislative session that just closed very recently. So we're very lucky. We sort of planned ahead to make sure we had a webinar to let everyone know in our school districts and our partners and the folks that work with us what happened in the session. We have some great guest speakers this morning that are joining us that are going to summarize some things that are important to you and also important to your students. So we're going to go ahead and review all of the important legislation that was going on in schools because it was quite a year. So if you're just joining us for the first time, Texas OnCourse is housed at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. And with Texas OnCourse, all students, no matter where they come from or where they're headed, have a plan for success after high school. So we're a state-funded initiative. We focus on college and career readiness, and we have been around since about 2015. So if you have attended a webinar previously, you'll know that we have a email that follows up our webinar after a couple of business days. We give you the links and the resources that we covered in the webinar, and we also post our recordings to YouTube. So we share the webinar recording with everyone that is registered, whether they attended live or watch the recording later. So if you could take a second and just like us on YouTube, this is where we will post all of our videos. We have videos as well that are in the Academy and other resources there, and you can get notifications and also search by topic on the YouTube channel. So we have just a quick welcome and introduction of our folks that are on this particular webinar. We have Educate Texas joining us this morning. So after we do a couple of quick introductions, we'll have our 87th legislative update from two of our guest speakers from Educate Texas, Priscilla Garcia, Director of Policy, and Ryan Franklin, Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy. Next, we're gonna switch gears a little bit, and Sam Kimmel, our high school program coordinator here at Texas OnCourse on our content and resources team, is going to highlight some resources we have in preparation from legislative mandates that we already know about. We have a lot of people talking about financial aid, so we have some great resources to share. We have some updates to our academy, and then we will continue to develop things based on, what we learned today on our legislative update. And then we'll have time for question and discussion and be able to open it up to our attendees. My name's Laura Googin. I'm Director of Program Implementation at Texas OnCourse. I have a college and career counseling background. We are here in Austin, and I work directly with the school districts that are using Texas OnCourse to support their implementation. Priscilla?
Yes, good morning. This is Priscilla Garcia, Director of Policy. Thank you for having us this morning. Ryan and I, our Senior Director of Policy, work together closely at Educate Texas. We've had the pleasure of working with OnCourse through the years and sort of planning and process work. But we're a nonprofit organization that is an initiative of Communities Foundation of Texas. And we're excited to chat with you this morning about the legislative session. I'll let Ryan sort of, are we jumping right in, or you just wanted me to say hello?
No, that's perfect, Priscilla. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ryan and just let him do a quick introduction, and then we'll cover everything.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to join you. My name is Ryan Franklin. I'm the Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy at Educate Texas. I'm glad to be joined by Priscilla Garcia, who is who's more veteran of the organization than I am. I come most recently from the Texas Education Agency, where I oversaw the work with the State Board for Educator Certification. So really excited to be in this space and to be able to provide some legislative updates today.
Great. Thank you, Priscilla, and thank you, Ryan, for joining us this morning. We've got some great updates to cover. Samantha?
Oh, yes. Hello, everyone. Sam Kimmel here. And as Laura mentioned, I work with Texas OnCourse on our content and resources team. I focus on our high school related content. And prior to joining Texas OnCourse a little over a year ago, I spent about 6 years providing direct service and managing a college readiness program that served middle and high school students in the Austin Independent School District. And I have to say, I'm also excited to hear from our presenters this morning. So happy to be here and talk with y'all all.
Great. Thank you, Sam. All right, Ryan and Priscilla, we're going to turn it over to you for your updates.
Thanks so much. And just it's great to see all the intros and the taco spots and everything. This is really nice to be with you today. Wanted to start with first just kind of getting your quick take on what you would like to learn more about today, kind of what's relevant to you. I think the prompt is on that slide there. So what's one issue that you've heard about, or something coming out of the legislative session that you'd like to learn more about? So feel free to use the chat. I'm going to give just a second here, try to practice a little wait time and make sure we hit on some of those topics.
Great. And Ryan, while you're reading, I'm just going to call a few out. Financial aid we'll cover. I saw CTE funding, counseling responsibilities, tracking TASFA, Senate Bill 179. I know the chat goes fast. Remote and hybrid learning. I've seen that a few times. Remote learning, CCMR and course planning. Changes to STAR, accountability. These are great. Thank y'all so much.
Really appreciate y'all adding those in. And I think we will be able to, between Priscilla and me, be able to cover most, if not all of those. And if we can't, we are absolutely happy to follow up coming out of today. So this is awesome. Thank you so much. So as Priscilla mentioned, we are an educational initiative of the Communities Foundation of Texas. And so we really work on strengthening public and higher education system in Texas so that every student is prepared for and achieve success in school and in the workforce and beyond. So really excited to be part of this work, and a whole lot of alignment between what we do and what the good work y'all are doing out in the field. I come from background as a middle school and high school English teacher in a couple of different very small, very rural districts in Central Texas. So I worked for the legislature for a while, and as I mentioned, worked at TEA for quite a while. And Priscilla's also a former educator, and we've worked together for a number of years. Originally with me at the legislature and her at TEA, and then us sort of flip-flopping roles as she moved to Educate Texas, and I joined TEA. So we're really excited to be able to be with you today to provide a bit of an update. A little bit about how we go about our work. We really work in terms of agenda setting, and so less so on specific bills as they move through the process, but more on trying to influence the broad policy strokes across public education, higher education, and the workforce. Throughout the interim, we try to build awareness and dialogue of key issues that our students and schools are facing. We have a significant amount of programmatic work that we do at Educate Texas in support of college and career readiness initiatives, and we try to highlight those best practices in policy and programs. And we try to be a resource to stakeholders in the legislature, in the relevant state agencies, and across the spectrum of education policy and advocacy. in what was the most unusual legislative session for those of us that have been around it a while. Some of the basic facts: the legislature meets for 140 days every other year. There are 150 House members who serve 2-year terms and 31 senators who serve staggered 2 or 4-year terms. There were over 7,000 or right around 7,000 bills filed in this legislative session, with a little over 1,000 that ultimately made their way through the process toward passage. So, we went into session with very low expectations and concerns about the budget. The impacts of the pandemic really covered and factored in heavily there. And then by the time mid-February rolled around, as we all know, the Winter Storm Uri hit, and that took a significant amount of attention away from other issues and focused it on those energy issues and those of the utilities and regulation of those things. So it was a very strange session. Every session has its own personality, but this one was particularly special as it moved through. To start, would like to hit a few of the kind of big ticket items, but before I do that, I want to give a few caveats. First, a lot of the things we're going to highlight here have not been signed into law by Governor Abbott. That veto deadline is June 20th. So really, until it's either been signed into law by Governor Abbott or been vetoed, we don't totally know for sure what will ultimately become law. There's still a lot of dust left to settle. Even when we do reach the point of something passing, there's going to be a lot of discretionary rulemaking and policy making at the agency level, and as well as with local schools making their interpretations and making policy decisions. This is by no means comprehensive. This is sort of the sampler platter of legislative session updates, and I would encourage you to, for things that you're particularly interested in, read the bill for yourself, talk with folks at the local level and with your other professional organizations to get the deeper dive and the kind of the deep picture of, and to make sure you have the understanding relevant for you and your students. At the statewide level, we went in really worried about the budget and really concerned about whether or not the state would have the resources to sustain the investments in school finance made with House Bill 3 last session. So I do want to highlight the budget picture as we went through session ended up being much better. The legislature did fully fund the investments from last session in House Bill 3, including enrollment growth, provided significant funding, both state and federal funding, for targeted programs for students in schools affected by the pandemic. Another statewide, and we usually say the budget is the one bill the legislature has to pass, and so they did that and did that with relatively little fanfare or drama by legislative standards. The other big statewide bill that I know has wide implications across the state, particularly with all the rural members I saw, and rural folks chiming in on the chat, broadband. And this House Bill 5 by Representative Ashby from Lufkin established a state broadband development office in the comptroller's office. This bill really creates the infrastructure and the backbone to support expanded investments from the state in broadband. So we're not going to flip a switch and suddenly have broadband everywhere, but the state's really been behind in recent years of being able to access federal funding and other funding sources to distribute it. And so this really calls for the mapping and the infrastructure to support those investments, not just in our rural communities, but also in our urban communities that lack access for different reasons, often beyond just the infrastructure. So these are some big statewide sweeping pieces that have wide implications across the state. I want to talk a little bit about sort of school finance and the pandemic response, and we'll try to section this out a little bit by topic. And coming out of House Bill 3 in the last session, there were obviously some tweaks and cleanups on anything that massive. And so House Bill 1525 by Representative Huberty ended up being the catch-all cleanup bill. And in addition to some cleanup items, it added in some other pieces specifically related to the pandemic response. including establishing some COVID-19 learning acceleration supports. The bill reinstated the gifted and talented allotment, which had been around prior to House Bill 3. As I saw someone mention in the chat, it adjusted the CTE funding and put higher weights on those courses that are part of the approved programs of study, and sort of differentiated the weight by the upper level courses as a way to encourage students to continue within those programs of study. Some tweaks to the college career military readiness outcome bonus by allowing an associate's degree earned in high school or within a reasonable time upon completion of high school to count for that outcomes bonus for schools. Some expanded funding and option for P-TECH, Regional Pathways Network, and the JET program. And there are also some, this was a very long bill, a lot of changes, and ended up catching some other bills that had been moving through session. So there were some changes related to human sexuality instruction, switching that to be an opt-in instead of an opt-out, and requiring additional transparency related to that instruction. So a whole lot of other things in what will be known as the House Bill 3 cleanup bill. You hear folks talk about it a lot of different ways, but those are some of the kind of quick highlights there for that. On the mental health side, there were some allowances, even in the school finance bill, for how some of the compensatory education allotment funded could be used for some things related to mental health. There's also sort of a cleanup and some adjustment here to the public school task force on mental health services, providing more access to data, including data from districts. So there were some tweaks there. A bill that I feel like we could have spent the whole hour on is House Bill 4545 by Chairman Didnt on the House side. This bill focuses on learning loss and accelerated instruction and those frameworks. It really changes what had been the grade placement committee to be an accelerated learning committee, especially for those students in 3rd, 5th, and 8th grade who aren't successful on the test. It really spells out the detailed framework of the local supports necessary for students who are not performing on grade level. So I would definitely encourage y'all to dig in there on that one. It sets up, I would equate it to a mini individualized education program for any student who's not successful and who's falling behind. And it's going to require a lot of focus and energy for our districts moving forward. So definitely want to put that one on your radar to maybe dig in a little more around. I think the next slide has the piece that many of you were the most interested in around the school counselor work time. And I think this was my 8th legislative session to be either working in or around the legislature. And I know a version of this bill has been filed every one of those sessions, and it finally got across the finish line. So I think this is a tribute to the good work that so many of you do out in the field and the importance of the roles you serve. And I think Priscilla's been chiming in some in the chat, but it does require districts to ensure that counselors spend at least 80% of their time performing counseling duties aligned with the comprehensive school counseling program. And it includes an explicit exclusion of assessment administration. There is some flexibility for smaller districts, but as a whole, this really does intend to prioritize the work of counselors. The other big piece that deals with sort of continuing education requirements, which cut across all certified educators, is Senate Bill 1267 by Senator West, which establishes a clearinghouse of continuing education and training requirements. This will ultimately provide a lot more flexibility over continuing education for teachers, principals, to a lesser extent counselors, but still quite a bit of flexibility there. I know the TELPAS calibration requirement has long been sort of a thorn in folks' sides, so it prohibits folks repeatedly having to recalibrate or get training on that unless something has changed significantly. So Priscilla, I want to give a second there. I know you've been watching the chat. Anything you want to chime in on before we go any further?
The only thing I would say is that, as always, you all have lived this. Some of this will hit each district a little differently. And so I think that it's important to to know that much of the legislation always gives a little bit of flexibility to local implementation. And so if it goes back, you know, if it looks different, that's on purpose. I know there was a question about the mental health slide, Ryan, if we could go back one. Is there a specific question about the mental health, Sherry? Okay, if you can type it. And no, SB 179 has not been signed. We have no reason to believe it won't be, but we can't say yes until it's signed.
And I see kind of a follow-up question to see if we can repeat what funds can be used for mental health.
It's
Yeah,
pretty
so-
broad.
Yeah, so there were some adjustments to the compensatory education allotment that made some changes related to waiting for homeless students, also allowing comp ed funds to pay for a coach to help disadvantaged students, to cover some of the duties performed by attendance officers, as well as programs to build skills related to social and emotional wellness. So a lot more details in the bill there, but that's kind of the highlight of some of the pieces there in that bill.
And Ryan, somebody asked about the definition for counselors. In the statute, it references school counselors that tag back to 33.006. This is, sorry, nerd speak for us, but it's the school counselor section. Ryan, am I right in understanding that that is a person that's certified to be a school counselor?
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
Priscilla, I think this is something where the Texas Association of School Boards will likely put out some model policy and guidance for districts moving forward, but that is my understanding that it is specifically for certified school counselors.
And I think this last question about, are there grants or streamlined systems for virtual or teledoc visits? I think that really will depend on the districts and using dollars in that manner. I imagine that is, I do feel like that's an allowable use. It's just whether the districts choose to do that. There's nothing currently from that was in statute that explicitly funds a grant to do that work. But I think the funds could be used in that manner if the district decided.
There were some other broader pieces outside education that dealt with telehealth and telemedicine, and I'm not as familiar with the details of that, but that's something we can see what we can find and maybe share back out. So moving forward just a little bit, I know there were a lot of questions about testing, graduation, attendance, those sorts of things. Again, lots of details here. So this is a higher level. We could spend an hour on any one of these, but I think the first one there is House Bill 3261, which primarily deals with the electronic administration of assessments and really establishes electronic assessments as a default beginning in the 2022-2023 school year. To allow for that, it creates some additional flexibility in the instructional materials and technology allotment to allow for internet connectivity and staff training in administering electronic assessments. Establishes a matching state grant program to help with some of those transition costs. Allows state assessment on Mondays. Limits the weighting of multiple choice items to no more than 75% of total available points. So this is specifically for the state assessment. So specifically for STAR, and I don't believe would have any bearing on your SAT, ACT, AP, any of those other non-state exams. So a lot of moving parts there related to assessment. The individual graduation committees, I know a lot of you've probably been dealing with this in real time as this bill moved through the process, but for the current year's seniors, House Bill 999 passed to allow the individual graduation committees to consider other criteria to make graduation determinations. House Bill 1603 removed the expiration date for the individual graduation committees, and it maintains the same process that's been in place, but that's one that's been around for a little while and has had changes to the expiration date, and this just sort of made those graduation committees permanent. And finally, a bill that deals on the attendance side with students who have long-term or life-threatening illnesses, allowing those with appropriate documentation to be a valid exemption from attendance-based promotion or graduation requirements. Again, this is one that I am sure TASB is going to do a lot more to define around kind of providing model policy for districts and what's included or not included there. So I think there will be some additional rulemaking probably from TEA and then additional guidance from TASB and others there around what is and isn't included in this bill. Next thing I want to talk about a little bit around dual credit and college career military readiness outcomes bonuses. I already mentioned the change to allow the associate's degree to count toward the outcomes bonus. Additionally, Senate Bill 1277 deals with the dual credit agreements between IHEs and schools and requiring someone to be the designated point person for academic advising for students before they can begin a dual credit course. And so this is intended to strengthen that advising. I think most of you are probably already doing this, but for agreements moving forward, ensuring that that's documented and accounted for in those agreements. The CTE programs of study, adding that is an additional accountability indicator in the public school accountability system. And then the military readiness definition was expanded to include enlistment as the Texas National Guard as an indicator of military readiness. I know those the state's access to that enlistment data has been something that hasn't been available yet. And so I think that's folks are continuing to work on that, but that additional category was added to the list in addition to the other armed forces there. So pause there. Priscilla, anything we can follow up on from the chat?
Yeah, the question about the car accidents, I need to go back. Ryan, it's the previous slide, I think, right? Attendance for students with severe injuries, illnesses. No, you go for it. Sorry, right there. So HB 699. Let me look that up real quick. I was looking up the other one, and I'll look at that. I think it's focused on, this is language from the bill, long-term and life-threatening illnesses. What I want to look is to see if there's any discretion on the decision-making there. And 1277, it says employee. So I think that's an interpretation piece.
I think it can be either one. I think it can be either at the college or the school, but just calls for that to be a conscious decision made as part of the agreement between the two.
And it doesn't state counselor, just because I know we have a lot of counselors on this list. Can you go to the next page, the next slide, sorry. Yeah, and so that'll answer that question. It can be an ISD or college employee. So this question about the military, Ryan, I don't know that the commissioner I know he was supposed to provide an update on the military piece, because I know they weren't able to track that. I have not heard any update since.
Yeah, no change to that this legislative session beyond expanding the definition to include this other population of Texas National Guard. So I think that's still waiting and wholly dependent on getting access to that data from the feds.
Right. And I would say in response to James's question, so currently military readiness is not counted into A through F accountability, and it is not currently counted into CCMR bonuses either.
And there is, going back to the question about the accident, there's one set of language in HB 699 that says if the student, and I'll put it in the chat. I think part of it is if you can get, if a parent or guardian provides a certification from the physician that specifying the illness or related treatment, I think there is probably some wiggle room if there is an accident that proves to be lead to an anticipated absence. So I think there will be some discretion, I guess. And yes, CTE is a part of the accountability. And one change, Brian, did you get to that already? You did, right?
Yeah, the adding it back into as an accountability indicator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So a couple of things related to financial aid that I wanted to highlight that I know are front and center for this group. One was a delay to the TAFSA implementation for the electronic TAFSA, having that be in 2023-2024 school year. This was largely due to the pandemic and delays related there. The other piece was requiring explicit notice to students or their parents with the opportunity to decline completing the financial aid application required for graduation, and some language around prohibiting counselors from indicating that a student hasn't completed the application unless the district has provided the opt-out form. So this language is a little wonky the way it's drafted, and I believe this is consistent with the recommendations and the direction that TEA was moving anyway. But this bill puts that in statute and puts that requirement there in law around that piece. Several pieces. So, before session, we thought this might be, and before the pandemic, we thought this would be a higher ed session. This was going to be similar to what the prior session was for K-12. And once the pandemic hit, everybody realized the attention would need to be spent elsewhere. But despite that, there were some really significant infrastructure sort of pieces put around and planning pieces on the higher ed side. So one piece is, I think most of you are familiar with the Tri-Agency Initiative, where the Texas Education Agency, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and the Texas Workforce Commission have informally worked together to try to collaborate and align some of their programmatic work. House Bill 3767 puts that in statute and calls for some shared goal setting and evaluation around career education and training programs. And so it sort of enshrines that in law and puts a framework in place for more legislative oversight into that collaboration and strengthening those arrangements and partnerships. Another piece that regionally I think will be very important and create a lot of potential is model data sharing agreements. Again, calling for TEA, the Coordinating Board, and Workforce Commission to develop some model FERPA compliant data sharing agreements so that every region of the state doesn't have to duplicate effort to ensure their programming and outcomes are aligned on a regional basis. So I know no conversations are ongoing across the agencies to develop those. And another piece, Priscilla, I'd love for you to expand a little bit on House Bill 1247 and the work-based learning piece.
Sure, and we worked on legislation like this previously, but many of you know there are some work-based learning efforts happening throughout, especially our high schools that have some teaming with workforce members and community colleges and 4 years, and that is all done, hook and crook at best I can say it. And so I think the goal here is to create a framework that makes definitions like what is work-based learning, how does it look, how are we defining the entities and all that, so that we can create some standards and coordinated efforts, especially regionally. I think that's a big question that we've had from workforce, the commission specifically, because they have these local boards that they can leverage to build some opportunities. We know that students learn wonderful things in these work-based settings, but they're really they're just not clear, and districts have little guidance in terms of, can they offer coursework time for it? Can they, excuse students from hours on campus and things like that? And so the goal is really to have the agencies work together so they can define those and hopefully build a better and clearer pathway for districts that want to grow this work in their districts. And I think there was a question about the opt-out form from Emily. Can you, I don't think it's not in statute. So it would be whether the agencies decide to look to build some, standard form or guidance. But at this point, each district will probably create their own.
I think they'll probably come up with some sort of model. They've had that working group that's been doing that, but can't say definitively. I think some of y'all have probably been closer to those conversations than we have. One more set of higher ed slides that I wanted to mention is the Community College Finance Commission. And this is largely modeled on the House Bill 3 School Finance Commission, and the focus is really on state appropriations for public, community, and junior colleges. Some of the issues of relevance that will be considered or relate to dual credit programs and cost, student graduation, transfer, and success metrics. So these are pieces that we would expect to deep dive into that would likely set up some of the conversations around the next legislative session and sort of informing that work ahead. One other key piece of legislation that got a lot of attention and is one that I would definitely recommend that y'all look at and read and interpret for yourself is House Bill 3979, which deals with a whole wide variety of issues associated with social studies curriculum, but also limiting how teachers can be required to discuss current events and what they must do if they do choose to discuss current events, allowing employees to opt out of trainings about certain topics related to race and sex. This was typically labeled the critical race theory bill and received a ton of attention. We'll put it in the chat so you can read it for yourself because there's a lot of moving parts there. It's intended to prohibit districts from accepting private funding for certain curriculum and professional development topics related to this. So this is one I think districts are largely going to be figuring out how to interpret and implement themselves. I think there will be guidance coming out from TASB probably and others about how to implement this. A couple of the topics that did not pass, but that are worth noting, the legislature ultimately ran out of time on a statewide funding mechanism for continuing remote or virtual instruction in the way that it had been done during the pandemic. They did pass a bill to create a commission to study this moving forward, but the bill itself to continue this and provide state funding did not pass. So I think there are a lot of ongoing conversations right now about whether Commissioner Morath has the authority and the ability to provide waivers to allow this. I know a lot of districts are providing this using some of their federal funds or other local fund balances, but this is one that did not pass that I think most of us expected to pass. Another key area where there were some discussions going into session, but ultimately nothing materialized was on transfer policy and sort of strengthening and streamlining some of those pieces. So nothing substantial passed there on that front. So a lot of times what didn't pass is just as important as what did pass. So I want to stop there. We've tried to address questions in the chat. I know a lot of you have pitched in and provided some other resources and links in the chat, and appreciate y'all doing that because a lot of y'all are closer to the work than we are on some of these detail pieces. So want to pause there and see if there's any other questions or things Priscilla and I can help with.
I just want to say one last thing too. I think it's important to note the chaos is going to continue. There should be a few more likely special session announcements and all that, but we don't have any info yet. Ryan, if he was a betting man, I think would bet something after July 4th, but there will be a special session for sure on districting that will likely happen this fall. And there's been a discussion of the federal fund discussion also coming together, bringing the legislature together around that. But we do suspect there will be some key issues that come up in special session. And if you haven't experienced the joy of that, it brings everybody back. There's a couple of called items that the legislature can focus on, and they don't usually last as long as the regular session. They have is it 30 days, Ryan, that it's expected?
That's right. Each special session can be for a maximum of 30 days.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan and Priscilla, for keeping track of all of the questions and making it through all of those really important updates. There were just so many hot topics to cover, and we had COVID, of course. And so I feel like you covered so much, so we appreciate it. We're going to kick it over to Sam Kimmel, who's actually going to talk a little bit about, I've seen some questions in the chat about financial aid. We have had a strong focus on this requirement even before this session, for sure. So Sam, we'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. And thank you again, Priscilla and Ryan. It's always so nice to hear some drilled down explanations of everything happening in the legislature. So again, really appreciate that. But as Laura mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about something that I have been personally involved in. We at Texas OnCourse have been working on for the past semester. So if you could go to the next slide here. So I assume most, if not everybody here is pretty familiar with the upcoming financial aid graduation requirement, but this was part of House Bill 3, which was from the previous legislative session. But this new requirement for high school seniors won't be going into effect until this school year. So just now, really taking the stage, and just want to be explicit with this language here, which I did see a lot of you guys popping in the chat. This is all available on Texas Education Agency's website. So we'll be sure to drop a link in the chat if you guys haven't already seen it. But starting the school year, all high school seniors will need to either complete the free application for federal student aid or FAFSA, or the Texas application for state financial aid or TASFA, or submit a formal opt-out agreement in order to graduate. And I do just want to make it clear that that opt-out agreement is for the graduation requirement itself. And so, if a student chooses to opt out of the requirement and later changes their mind and decides that they want to apply for financial aid, they will be able to, assuming that, of course, they are eligible through one of these avenues, applying for federal aid through the FAFSA or the state financial aid through the TASFA. So just laying that out on the table there, but excuse me. And yes, go ahead. So in response to that, because we know, and I know everybody who has been involved in financial aid knows as well, that it really takes a village to support students in completing a financial aid application. And this is a big push and a big ask. We are trying to get as many students, Texas students, as possible to complete an application, and it is going to take a lot of people to make that happen. So we have been working very closely with TEA to create a website that will have dedicated web pages to support the various stakeholders that are inevitably impacted by the requirements. So a web page for counselors and advisors, as well as for students and the families supporting them, and also community partners. And that ranges from, everything from college-based or college access organizations, community-based organizations, local institutions of higher education, and other just influencers and change makers in the community who really can and should be involved in efforts to get students just interested in and aware of financial aid and the benefits it can bring, as well as, really pushing them towards some type of post-secondary training or credential. So just a little quick sneak peek. This isn't the final form, but I really wanted to highlight here that this new website that we are developing is going to be available on the Texas OnCourse website. So for everybody familiar with our platform, especially, our counselors and advisors tuning in, you may already have Texas OnCourse in mind for next school year. Our academy provides online professional development on a variety of topics, and we will have updated modules dedicated to both the FAFSA and the TASFA. So while you're on our website looking for training that can meet your needs or those of your support staff or support team, you can also just head straight on over to this website and get that information you need, whether it's for you or for your students, families, or whomever you are working with. And just quickly, a little synopsis of what will be going into each of these web pages. First and foremost, we'll be laying out an explanation of the new graduation requirement to hopefully clear up some confusion or potential confusion, eliminate it rather, on everybody's end about what really this means, make sure there's access to things like opt-out forms and all of that good stuff. But in addition to that, for each of these audiences we're tailoring towards, we'll have some kind of suggested milestones and action items that we feel will really position everybody in a good place to complete this requirement. And that's going to also include strategies and really practical, tangible advice from people on the ground in other financial aid completions in the past, whether that be local or national. And so we wanted to highlight there. So, counselors, you guys can have tools and things to help plan a financial aid event. Community partners can have a needs assessment to identify how they can best collaborate with the districts they serve, and so on and so forth. But that's just kind of the website in a nutshell. And just quickly want to highlight a couple of benefits that we really feel will bring to you and we hope will bring to you. The first being just transparency. There's not going to be any paywalls or registration links. This information is out there, open, visible to everybody. And, my hope really is that especially for our kind of leaders leading these initiatives like counselors and community partners, you guys should be able to see what information our students and parents already getting. Is it sufficient? If it's not, we will of course like to know, but hopefully that will enable you guys to identify any potential gaps and just really build a collaborative solution to support Texas students. Additionally, really hoping with this that by providing a kind of like centralized hub for everything you need, it can save everyone time and effort during the planning process. Less Googling, more time just working with students. And that also goes with this convenience piece. Not only have we just been kind of consolidating and pulling in resources that we know work well from trusted sources like federal student aid, but we've also been developing some additional tools in-house to just try to make your lives easier. So again, the hope being you can spend less time planning your event and building resources and just more time providing that on-the-ground support we all know benefits students in the end. And that is really just what I wanted. Oh, and importantly, yes, this website will be live later this summer and by the start of the school year. And if you want to stay on top of that, I highly encourage you to sign up for our playbook if you haven't already. That is the Texas OnCourse monthly newsletter, and it always includes great information and resources, but that is where you will hear first about when our website is live and available. So that was, I have not been looking in the chat, but I'm not sure if there were any questions that I need to be asked. If not, I will go ahead and turn it back on to back over to Laura here, but again, happy to answer anything I can. Thanks, y'all.
Perfect. Thank you, Sam, so much. I know the chat goes really quickly, but I did want to mention that Tama from Texas OnCourse did put in the link there to our registration for the playbook. Just a couple of other announcements. So if you don't receive that already, we put all of our important announcements for people in districts and sort of boots on the ground in the playbook. We also are planning a financial aid training that's 3.5 hours in August. We're actually having one this June. It filled up in a matter of minutes. So we're going to put our team together and see. There's so much interest in this particular requirement, and so many more people are now going to be doing financial aid with families. A lot of people are increasing the number of training folks that are trained at their campuses and in the communities. So stay tuned for that. And if you sign up for the playbook, you'll get an invitation to that as well. So we usually take a minute here toward the last 10 minutes of our webinar to just take a moment, even though it's a collaboration in the chat box, but to just tell us a little bit about some things that you might be doing in your district to prepare. It could be preparation for financial aid. It could be preparation for one of the other topics that Ryan and Priscilla covered. I know we had a really sort of wild year in terms of remote instruction and the kind of instruction schools were able to provide. And it was really different from rural districts to large urban districts. But if you want to share some ideas in the chat just for a couple of minutes, one of the things that we like to do in the webinars is just provide some ideas back to everyone who has attended. So I'll give you a couple minutes to share some of your planning. I'm just going to address one question on, yes, we do have Applied Texas, which is out of the coordinating board and tracking students. Out of state and private applications, you can use the Common App if out of state and private institutions use the Common App. However, unless something has changed, the Common App does not necessarily generate reports for school districts regarding those applications, but you can at least see the status. And then your other option would be to have a membership to the National Student Clearinghouse information. Some schools have that information and some schools do not, but that will provide your enrollment for your direct to college enrollment, essentially, for your districts. Just to answer that question on college applications. This is not the first time I have heard of this Going Merry resource. We're going to learn a little bit more about that. But that's one idea, like a central hub and an online tool for financial aid. Yes, we have many people that are using Applied Texas. Many of you know there's a financial aid component to the Applied Texas Counselor Suite. We talk about that in our training a little bit. Thank you, Will, on the staff FAFSA and PD. Charlotte from Lubbock asked about the PEIMS documentation. This is not in place right now, but in upcoming school years, we can find this specific info, but in the upcoming school years, it is going to be PEIMS reported in your snapshot data and in your student management systems that will go to TEA, whether or not the students completed the FAFSA requirement. That's all I know right now, Charlotte, on the documentation. but there will be a data entry requirement in your SIS program to answer that question. And it also will be part of your TREX transcript exchange system from district to district. And yes, Brandolyn, students can apply for both state and federal aid. The FAFSA is regarding federal aid and also some state aid, and then the TASFA is for state aid.
Right, and I did want to clear that up real quick. So students who apply for federal aid through the FAFSA, in doing so, are also applying for state aid, right? So if they are eligible for that state aid, they may be awarded it or awarded by the institution. But there are certain students who may only be eligible for state or institutional aid, and so they would not be able to complete both applications and apply for federal aid. So just
yes, that's correct. I'm sorry if that was confusing. Thank you for clarifying, Sam.
It might not have been confusing. Just want to make it clear. Thanks.
Perfect. I think we are doing a great job answering as many questions as came in. I think that this is a great opportunity for us to sort of chat and have an opportunity to give updates and answer questions. I know we have not maybe covered all of them, but we certainly covered a lot. So please stay tuned for an email that provides the summary and answers to these questions. And special thanks to Ryan and Priscilla, as well as Sam, for these fantastic updates. I did want to mention we will have an email follow-up. And if you have attended a webinar at all this year, or maybe several, we are building our webinar series for next school year. So if you can take a few minutes and fill out that webinar, it is going to look like a survey, but it's really going to help shape our topics for the upcoming series. We had high attendance for all of our webinars this year, and we would like to continue to provide content and resources that are just really helpful for you all in your districts. So thank you all. We are at time, 11 a.m. Stay tuned for our email. Please take care and stay healthy and safe, and have a great summer. Thanks, everybody.